On the morning of October 14th, 1993, Dale Morrow's $183,000 grain dryer stopped running with 7,400 bushels of wet corn inside it. Not a slow failure, not a warning. The burner tripped on an overheat fault at 4:17 in the morning. The control board registered a propane pressure drop, and the whole system locked out. By the time Dale's hired man found it at 6, the corn inside the tower had been sitting without heat or airflow for nearly 2 hours. At 24% moisture in a sealed tower, 2 hours without movement is the beginning of something that cannot be undone. The corn was starting to heat. Dale called the service company in Denison at 6:15. They told him they could have a technician on site by the following afternoon, the earliest. They had 3 other calls ahead of him from the same October, the same wet harvest. Just the same propane pressure problems that had been rolling through Crawford County since the first week of the month, when the price had jumped from 72 cents a gallon to $1.40 overnight. Because the railroads moving propane east from the refineries were behind schedule, and the storage terminals were low, and every grain dryer in the state of Iowa was running around the clock burning fuel as fast as the suppliers could deliver it. $1.40 a gallon. Dale's dryer burned 280 gallons an hour at full capacity. He had done that math already. He had not enjoyed it. The technician arrived the following afternoon. The diagnosis took 4 hours. The pressure regulator on the burner manifold had failed, allowing the propane pressure to spike, which had tripped the overheat protection and locked the board. The part needed was not on the truck. It was not in the Denison warehouse. It was in a distribution center in Des Moines and could be delivered in 3 to 5 business days. 3 to 5 business days. Dale had 1,100 acres of corn to harvest, most of it running between 22 and 26% moisture. In a month, when the weather window between rain events was averaging 4 days, he could not wait 3 to 5 business days. The corn in the tower was already beginning to go off. He could smell it when he opened the access hatch. That specific sour warmth that wet grain produces when the microbes that live inside every kernel find the temperature and moisture they need to start working. Dale knew that smell. Every farmer in Iowa knew that smell. It was the smell of money becoming worthless. He stood at the base of his dryer tower on the afternoon of October 15th with his service technician, his hired man, and his agronomist, all of them looking at a machine that represented 6 years of loan payments and could not be fixed in time to matter. Then his agronomist said something. "Walt Greer's cribs are full." Dale looked at him. His corn cribs, on his place south of here. He put up 4 cribs in the 80s, runs them every year. His grandfather built the originals in 47. Dale, I have watched Walt Greer put wet corn in those cribs every October for 12 years and take dry corn out every March. He has never lost a bushel to heating. Dale said nothing for a moment. He looked at his dryer tower. Then he said, "Walt Greer dries corn in wooden cribs from 1947. His agronomist waited. "That is the most ridiculous thing I have heard this week," Dale said, "and this has been a very ridiculous week." His agronomist drove back to his office. Dale called Des Moines again about the part. "Let me tell you about Walt Greer, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his grandfather built." Walt was 58 years old in the fall of 1993. He had farmed 320 acres in Crawford County his entire adult life, taking over from his father in 1961. The Greer farm was not the largest operation in the county. It was not the most modern. Walt drove equipment that other farmers had moved past, maintained it himself in the red machine shed behind the farmhouse, and made decisions the way his grandfather Everett had taught him to make them, by asking what the farm could afford to lose before he committed to anything it might have to carry. He had not bought a grain dryer, not because he did not understand them. He understood them completely. He understood the capital cost, the operating cost, the propane consumption, the mechanical complexity, and the specific vulnerability of a system that required fuel delivery, electrical power, and functioning controls to operate. He understood all of it because he had watched his neighbors buy dryers through the 1970s and 1980s and had thought carefully about what they were buying along with the machine. What they were buying, in Walt's estimation, was speed, the ability to harvest wet corn, dry it quickly to safe storage moisture, and keep the combine moving. In a good year, on dry corn, the dryer sat unused. In a wet year, the dryer worked every hour it could, burning propane at a rate that ate deeply into the margin that the additional harvesting speed had created. The dryer was not free. The dryer was a bet that the speed was worth the cost. Walt had not taken that bet. He had his grandfather's corn cribs instead, 4 of them, built in 1947 by Everett Greer from white oak lumber that Everett had cut himself from timber on the farm's north fence line. 12 feet wide, 60 feet long, round-roofed, oriented east-west in a row south of the barn to catch the prevailing southwest Iowa wind. The horizontal slats spaced 7/8 of an inch apart, the measurement Everett had calculated over 2 winters before he cut the first board. Let me tell you about those 7/8 of an inch, because the measurement is the whole system. A corn crib works by airflow. The corn goes in wet at harvest moisture, which in Iowa runs from 18 to 28%, depending on the year and the hybrid. It comes out dry in the spring at 13 to 14%. Safe storage moisture that will hold through the summer without spoiling. The moisture leaves the corn because air moves through it continuously over the winter, carrying the water vapor away. For that to work, air has to move through the corn, and corn has to stay inside the crib. The slat spacing controls both. Too wide, and corn trickles out through the gaps, falling to the ground, lost. Too narrow, and the gaps clog with leaves and chaff during filling, blocking the airflow, killing the drying. The corn heats in the center of the crib where the air cannot reach, the same heating Dale was watching happen in his sealed tower on October 15th, and 1,000 bushels becomes compost. 7/8 of an inch lets air through without losing corn. It keeps the slats close enough to hold grain, but open enough that the wind flowing through the long axis of the crib, east to west, the direction of the prevailing southwest Iowa wind, can move through every layer from the outside walls to the center without obstruction. Everett had measured this, not from a book, not from an extension publication. He had built a test section in his workshop in the winter of 1945, filled it with corn at different moisture levels, and measured the airflow at different slat spacings with a simple anemometer he built from a tin can and a bent wire. He had run the test through 2 winters, adjusting the spacing 1/16 of an inch at a time, recording the results in a composition notebook that Walt still kept on the shelf in the machine shed. 7/8. That was the number Everett arrived at. Walt had never changed it. There was no reason to change it. The cribs dried corn every year. The measurement was right. Now let me tell you about the two paths, because the two paths are the whole point. Path 1, Dale Morrow and the dryer. In a good year, dry corn, mild fall, propane available at 72 cents, Dale's operation ran beautifully. His combine moved fast because he did not have to wait for the corn to dry in the field. He harvested at 22, 24, 26% moisture without slowing, ran the corn through the dryer, and moved it to flat storage at 14% ready for market. He could put 8,000 bushels through the dryer in a long day. His harvest window was not weather-dependent in the same way Walt's was, because the dryer bought him days and weeks he did not need from the field. In the good years, Dale's operation was faster, smoother, and more profitable per acre than Walt's. The numbers were real. A farmer who can harvest wet corn and dry it mechanically can start earlier in the season and finish earlier, reducing field losses to late-season weather. The dryer had paid for itself in speed in the 3 good years before 1993. Path 2, Walt Greer and the cribs. Walt harvested when the corn was ready, not dryer ready. He waited for the field moisture to come down naturally before he ran the combine, which in a wet year meant he waited longer than Dale and harvested later in the season. His combine moved at a pace set by field conditions, not by dryer capacity. He put corn in the cribs at 20 to 24% moisture in October and left it there until March, when it came out at 13 to 14%, dried by 5 months of Iowa winter air moving through 7/8 inch slats at no cost per bushel. In good years, Walt's system was slower. In the 12 years since he had rebuilt the cribs in 1981, Walt had never lost a bushel to heating, never paid a propane bill for grain drying, and never called a service technician at 6 in the morning during the 3rd week of October. The year 1993 was not a good year. The year 1993 was the year the two paths stopped running parallel and crossed each other head on. Let me tell you about that October, because it was the worst drying month in Crawford County in 40 years. The corn came off the stalk wet, not unusually wet. 24-25% moisture was within the normal range for October in Iowa. But the weather that should have dried it down in the field never came. September had been cool and wet. October started with 4 days of rain that kept the combines out of the field. When the weather cleared on October 8th, the corn was wet and the fields were soft, and every farmer in the county who had a dryer started running it around the clock to make up for lost time. The propane demand spiked on October 9th. By October 10th, the price had moved from 72 cents to $1.14. Just by October 12th, it was $1.40, and the suppliers were talking about allocation, meaning some customers would get what they needed and some would not, and the ones who would not were not going to be told in advance which category they were in. Dale had 12,000 gallons of propane capacity on his farm. At 280 gallons per hour of dryer operation, that was 42 hours of full capacity drying. He had been running the dryer for 6 days before the burner failed. He had received one propane delivery of 8,000 gallons in that time at $1.31 a gallon. The delivery cost him $10,480. He had another delivery scheduled for October 16th that the supplier called to postpone on the morning of October 15th due to driver availability. Let me give you the numbers as they stood when Dale called the service company. Corn in the tower, 7,400 bushels at 24% moisture, beginning to heat. Cost to replace the failed part, $340 plus labor. Time to receive the part, 3 to 5 business days. Value of the corn in the tower if it heated past recovery, approximately $14,800 at current prices, gone. Propane delivery postponed, 6,000 gallons, rescheduled to unknown date. Harvest remaining, approximately 600 acres of corn, most of it between 22 and 26% moisture. Days of good weather remaining before the next rain event. The forecast said 4. Harvest capacity without the dryer, 0. Dale's operation had been built around the dryer. Without it, he had nowhere to put wet corn. He stood at the base of his tower on the afternoon of October 15th and looked at his agronomist's suggestion one more time. Walt Greer's cribs. He did not like the suggestion. He had been telling people about his $183,000 dryer for 3 years. He had told Walt directly the previous spring at the co-op that corn cribs were a 1940s solution to a problem that modern equipment had permanently solved. Walt had listened to that without arguing. He had looked at the ground for a moment. Then he had asked, "What happens if the propane runs short?" Dale had not answered that. He had changed the subject. "Let me tell you about the walk across the field, because that is where the story turns." Dale drove to Walt's farm on the afternoon of October 15th. He parked beside the machine shed. Walt was on a ladder against the second crib, checking the slat condition on the south face. He climbed down when he heard the truck. He looked at Dale. He waited. "Dale," Walt said. "Walt." Dale looked at the cribs, then at the ground. "I have a problem, I heard," Walt said. He was not smiling. He was not making it small or making it large. He simply stood in his faded Carhartt bibs in the October light and waited for Dale to say what he had come to say. "My dryer is down. Part is 3 to 5 days out." Walt nodded once. "I have got corn heating in the tower," Dale said, "and another 4 days of weather and nowhere to put what I pull out of the field." Walt looked at the cribs. He looked at Dale. He said, "How wet is it running?" 22 to 24 out of the field, maybe higher in the low spots." Walt thought about it. He said, "My south crib is empty, room for about 4,000 bushels." He paused. "I can take another 2,000 in the north crib on top of what's already in there if you go in slow and don't push the airflow." Dale was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he said. Walt looked at him. Same as always with neighbors. Dale shook his head. "Walt, this is more than neighborly." Walt said, 2 cents a bushel. That is what my grandfather charged in 1953 when Harv Tillman's combine burned down and Harv needed somewhere to put his corn. 2 cents a bushel." He looked at Dale. "Call it, even if you help me pull the south crib access doors before your truck arrives. They stick in the cold." Dale looked at the cribs. He had made fun of these buildings 3 years ago at the co-op. He had said the words 1940 solution with the specific confidence of a man who believed that year of manufacture was equivalent to quality of thinking. Oh, he was standing in front of those buildings now with 7,400 bushels of corn going off in a sealed tower and 4 days of weather left in the month. He said, "I will be here in the morning. Let me pause here and tell you something about what a corn crib does that a propane dryer cannot. A propane dryer applies heat. It forces high-temperature air through the grain mass, driving moisture out of the kernels rapidly. A batch that comes in at 24% moisture goes out at 14% in 12 to 16 hours. It is fast, it is controllable, it is also violent, in the specific sense that rapid heat application stresses the corn kernel, cracking the pericarp, the outer skin, and creating stress fractures in the endosperm that a propane dried kernel carries into storage and that reduce its test weight and its milling quality. A corn crib does something different. It does not heat the corn. It moves air through the corn slowly, continuously over months. The moisture leaves the kernel gradually, the way moisture leaves anything left in a dry room over time. Not driven out by force, but drawn out by the difference between the moisture in the kernel and the moisture in the surrounding air. The process takes 5 months instead of 12 hours. The corn kernel is never stressed. It comes out of the crib in March, with its pericarp intact, its test weight full, and its germination rate, if it is seed corn, unchanged. Everett Greer had understood this in 1947, not from research papers, from watching what happened to corn that had been heated too fast. It came out dry, but it came out hard and brittle in ways that cost fractions of a cent per bushel at the elevator that added up to real money over a lifetime. Slow drying produced better corn. The crib produced slow drying. The crib was not a primitive solution to grain drying. It was a sophisticated solution that the industry had abandoned in favor of speed, and speed had costs that did not always appear on the line item where you expected to find them. Dale Morrow's dryer had cost him $183,000 plus 6 years of interest payments. It had consumed $10,480 in propane in 6 days of operation. The part that failed cost $340. The service call cost $210. The corn heating in the tower represented $14,800 in potential losses. Walt Greer's cribs had cost his grandfather approximately $1,200 in lumber and hardware in 1947. As Walt had rebuilt them in 1981 for $3,400 in materials. Their operating cost every year was $0. They had never failed to dry corn in 46 years of use. Let me tell you about the 11 days because that is how long Dale's dryer was down. The part arrived not in 3 to 5 business days, but in 8. It was installed on October 23rd. The dryer came back online at noon. By that time, Dale had put 5,800 bushels of wet corn into Walt's south crib and 1,900 into the north crib. He had harvested his 4 good days of weather and banked the corn in the only place available to bank it. He had also watched the cribs work, not dramatically, not spectacularly. The same way a well works. You cannot see it doing anything, and nothing is happening that you can point to. But the thing it is supposed to do is being done continuously without anyone managing it or paying for it or worrying about whether the pressure regulator is going to fail at 4 in the morning. The southwest Iowa wind moved through the crib slats at Walt's standard airflow rate of about 60 cubic feet per minute per bushel of corn, slower than a propane dryer's forced air, fast enough to move moisture steadily. The temperature differential between the corn and the outside air drove evaporation from the kernel surface. The airflow carried the vapor out through the east face of the crib, and the corn cooled and dried without anyone touching it. On the third day, Dale came out and stood beside the south crib and put his hand against the slats on the south face. He could feel the air moving through, not a strong draft, a steady breath. Cool and slightly humid on the downstream side, dry on the upstream side. Walt was watching from the machine shed doorway. "He goes all winter like this?" Dale asked. Walt said, "All winter." Dale took his hand off the slat. He did not say anything else. He walked back to his truck and drove home. If you want to know what Dale Morrow said to Walt at the grain elevator the following spring, and what he said at the co-op the spring after that, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me if anyone in your family ever used a corn crib. Tell me what happened to it. The part that took 8 days cost $340. The service call cost $210. The corn that had been heating in the tower when Dale found it at 6 in the morning on October 15th was partially salvageable. About 4,800 of the 7,400 bushels came out at acceptable quality. The other 2,600 bushels were discounted at the elevator to the point where Dale received $1.40 per bushel instead of $2.17. The loss on those 2,600 bushels was $2,002. The total incident cost, including the service call, the part, the lost value on the heated corn, and 11 days of harvest interruption that forced Dale to hire a custom combining crew at $38 per acre to complete his last 200 acres before the weather changed, came to approximately $19,400. Walt charged Dale 2 cents a bushel for 7,700 bushels of crib storage space. That was $154. Dale paid it in cash at the kitchen table in November, after the corn in the cribs had been checked and was drying well, and the threat of heating had passed. He set the bills on the table without saying anything. Walt looked at the money. He picked it up. He put it in his shirt pocket. Dale sat at the table for a moment. Then he said, "When my grandfather farmed, he had corn cribs." Walt looked at him. "He sold them in 1971 to buy a grain bin setup," Dale said, "when the new dryers started coming in. He said the cribs were obsolete." He paused. "He died in 79. He never saw a propane spike." Walt nodded once. "My grandfather said they were obsolete," Dale said. "Mine did too." His voice was different from the voice he had used at the co-op 3 years ago when he had said the words 1940 solution. That voice had been the voice of a man who was certain. This voice was the voice of a man who had spent 11 days watching certainty fail. Walt looked at him. "Your grandfather was right about the dryer being faster," he said. "He wasn't wrong about that." He paused. He was wrong about faster being the same thing as better. Dale was quiet. "The dryer is better in a good year," Walt said. No question. He put his hands flat on the kitchen table. "But we do not only farm in good years." Dale drove home. He did not scrap his dryer. The dryer was 6 years of loan payments, and he needed it for the speed in the years when the speed mattered. But he called a contractor in December and asked about adding corn crib capacity to his operation. The contractor told him that good used crib lumber was hard to find, and new construction ran about $4.20 a linear foot for the walls alone. "How does Walt Greer's crib run?" the contractor asked. "I did some work out there in the '80s. "Good," Dale said. "Never a problem." The contractor was quiet for a moment. "That is old-growth white oak lumber in those slats," he said. "Everett Greer cut it himself off that farm's timber in '47. You cannot buy that today at any price." He paused. "Those cribs are going to outlast everything else on that farm." Dale thought about that for a while. Then he said, "What would it cost to build 4 of them?" Let me tell you about the years after, because this story does not end at a kitchen table in November. Walt Greer farmed his 320 acres until 2004, when his knees and his back decided the matter for him. His son Gary had been farming alongside him since 1989, and the transition was the kind that happens when there is no debt to argue about and no lender to satisfy. Gary simply took over the operations, and Walt continued to walk the fields and offer his opinion, which Gary found useful and did not always take. The corn cribs passed to Gary with everything else. Gary maintained them the way Walt had maintained them, and Everett had built them, checking the slat condition every fall before fill, replacing individual boards when they cracked or swelled, keeping the roof sound and the access doors tight. In 2004, one of the cribs needed 11 new slats on the north face, where ice had worked behind the wood over 3 winters. Gary cut the replacements from white oak he sourced from a sawmill in Ida County. It cost him $180 and a Saturday afternoon. The cribs were built in 1947. As of the last fall Gary ran them, they were 76 years old and drying corn. Dale Morrow built 2 new corn cribs in 1994, the spring after the dryer failure, not the full system, 2, for a combined capacity of about 8,000 bushels. He used them as a buffer. When the dryer was running well, he used the dryer, and when the dryer was not running well, he had somewhere to put the corn that did not involve watching it heat in a sealed tower. The propane price spiked again in 1996. Dale's dryer ran on reduced capacity for 11 days while he waited for a delivery. The 2 cribs absorbed 6,200 bushels without complaint. He told this to someone at the co-op that winter. He said, "My grandfather sold his corn cribs in 1971. He thought they were finished." He paused. He was wrong by at least 50 years. A Merle Gustafson, different county, same story, would have understood that sentence. Let me tell you about Walt Greer at the grain elevator in the spring of 1994, because it is the last public scene of this story, and it is the quietest one. Dale was at the elevator the same morning, selling corn out of the flat storage he had managed to fill after the dryer came back online in late October. The corn had graded out at 54-pound test weight, acceptable but not exceptional. The elevator manager noted it in the scale ticket. Walt's corn came out of the cribs in March at 13.5% moisture and 56-pound test weight. Better than Dale's by 2 pounds per bushel. The elevator manager noted that too. The difference in price was 11 cents per bushel on 7,700 bushels. The corn Walt had dried in the cribs, including Dale's, that was $847. Dale was standing at the elevator scale house when the manager read Walt's ticket. He looked at the test weight number. He looked at Walt. Walt was folding his scale ticket into his shirt pocket. He looked up and saw Dale looking at him. "56 pound," Dale said. Walt said, "Slow drying." Dale nodded. He looked at his own ticket. 54. "The crib does not heat the corn," Walt said. He put his hand in his pocket. "It just breathes it dry." He paused. "My grandfather said that a kernel you treated gently on the way in was a kernel that came out right on the way out." Dale looked at the scale house and then at the cribs visible on Walt's property a mile south, the 4 round-roofed buildings standing in their east-west row in the March light. He said, "How long did Everett say those cribs would last?" Walt thought about it. He said, "Long enough." He got in his truck and drove home. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories about the measurements taken in winter by men who were thinking about what would be needed next fall and the fall after that and the fall 40 years after that. About the buildings that outlasted the machines that were supposed to replace them. About the farmers who understood that speed has a price and patience has a value, and the system that does nothing flashy and costs nothing to run and never calls for a service technician at 4 in the morning is a system that deserves more respect than it gets. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, did your family have corn cribs? Did you watch them come down? Did anybody tell you why they were better or worse than what replaced them? Everett Greer measured those slat gaps in 1945 in his workshop with a tin can anemometer and a composition notebook. He arrived at 7/8 of an inch. He cut the lumber himself. He built 4 cribs. He charged Harv Tillman 2 cents a bushel in 1953 when Harv needed somewhere to put his corn. Walt charged Dale 2 cents a bushel in 1993. Same rate, same cribs, same 7/8 of an inch. Some measurements do not become obsolete. The wind still blows from the southwest. The corn still needs to breathe. The slats are still the right distance apart. The cribs are still standing.